This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the box was cardboard, the detective was dying, and the bridge was Thor, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
Have you ever stopped to wonder why James Fillmore disappeared looking for his umbrella? Or just how parsley can manage to sink into the butter?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Bert Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 179, I Must Confess. Hello and welcome to Trifles, a Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about some of the details in the stories. I am Scott Monty.
I am Bert Wolder.
And together we are here to bring you some of the confessions that were wheedled out of people in the canon this time around. It's going to be an interesting episode, to say the least. Well, before we get into that, just a reminder that you can find us at SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. The specific show notes for this episode are available at ihose.co/Trifles179, all lowercase. And we, of course, are I Hear of Sherlock on all the main social networks. And if you have a comment that you'd like to send in, just send it to trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. Well, Bert, I must confess. Well, first of all, I must confess it's a pleasure to be here with you, as always.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yes. I know one of my favorite examples in the Sherlock Holmes stories of the trick confession happened in The Three Students. And the fact that this happened in an academic setting is marvelous because it actually allowed me to go on and use the same kind of psychology on students that I was overseeing at the time. I was a resident assistant at Boston University, and I lived for 4 years in Warren Towers, which is the largest residence hall on campus. Over 1,800 students living in 3 towers that are connected at the 4th floor with a cafeteria and other administrative things. So it was a lot of bodies to oversee and a lot of chaos happening between 18 to 20-year-olds, as you would imagine. And it was on reading The Three Students that I realized a wonderful method for getting a confession out of somebody. And it happened when I think Holmes was confronting Bannister, the butler. And of course you recall that Bannister was covering for Gilchrist. He's the one who seemingly fainted or at least needed to sit down on that chair across the room where he covered up Gilchrist's gloves that were on the chair. And they're in Soames' office, they're confronting Bannister, and in comes Gilchrist. Or excuse me, they're confronting Gilchrist and they bring Bannister in. And he says, Holmes says, now just close the door. We're all quite alone here. No one need ever know one word of what passes between us. We can be perfectly frank with each other. We want to know, Mr. Gilchrist, how you, an honorable man, ever came to commit such an action as that of yesterday. And the unfortunate man staggered back and cast a full look of horror and reproach at Bannister. No, Mr. Gilchrist, sir, I never said a word, never one word, cried the servant. No, but you have now, said Holmes. And that very example there of letting Bannister out himself, to me was one of the prime examples of a confession that happened in the canon. And to bring it back home to show you how I use this on a couple of my students, appliances, cooking appliances were not allowed in the dormitory. And I knew that there was some kind of cooking going on because the dishes were in the sink in the main area. So, you can kind of, make an educated guess on this stuff. And I was standing by the elevator, and some of the students whom I suspected were standing there. And I said, hey, how's that rice cooker working out for you? And they said, how did you know we had a rice cooker? I said, well, I didn't, but I know now. The same kind of method that Holmes used against Bannister there.
Yeah, well, that's very good. I like that.
Yeah, well, it's a matter of finding people who are at least aware enough to have a guilty conscience. The sociopaths that don't care, you're never going to get a true confession out of them. I was always astounded watching the old Perry Mason episodes, how they could have somebody crack under pressure on the witness stand. It doesn't seem like that happens much today.
No, it doesn't. Well, that was, a lovely, largely imaginary factor of the arc of those old Perry Mason stories. It's interesting. I noticed that the new Perry Mason that's coming out, I guess it's on HBO, has Perry starting out as a private investigator, and it's very much a noir kind of a fedora wearing, hard drinking kind of a Perry Mason reboot. And I don't remember any of that in my Perry Mason backstory, but what do I know? Yeah.
Well, I'd have to go back. I think the first Earl Stanley Gardner story, Perry Mason story, was written in 1927 or so. But that harkens back to a time when people were more honorable, or you'd like to think they were more honorable. There was some kind of pride in character at the time. It seems to be less so today. So let's stick to the mystery stories we have before us. Let's see if we can pick out a few confessions and explore them and perhaps compare and contrast. The first two stories that we have in the canon, these are of the longer sort, A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four. But what you have is a criminal that's been apprehended at the end, someone who has been responsible for some deaths, who then gives a full confession. And in each of those cases, it seems like, well, first of all, it was a sympathetic character. It was someone who struggled with something, whether it was love or greed or, other human frailties. And I think each realized that he was at the end of his rope, that he was caught dead to rights, and at least owed himself a clean breast of the situation.
Well, that's a very good point. I never really thought about I suppose my view of the cases of Sherlock Holmes, and the Three Students is a great example, and these others are good examples too, tends to view the event of the confession as an example of the cleverness of the writer. So in other words, the Three Students, imagine what a 1-minute version of the Three Students would be. Well, the 1-minute version would be, Mr. Holmes, you have to help me. Do you happen to have any tall students who are sitting for this examination? Tall students? Why do you ask? Well, it would have required a tall person to be able to see the papers on your desk. My God, I never thought of that. And that's the end of the story. But the genius of Conan Doyle is, that he creates these characters. He puts a Bannister on the scene, these little bits of evidence, the profiles of the individual students. He doesn't really tell you much about the third student, who's very rude. We have the distraction of the pencil. So all of that, I tend to think of it as sort of an authorial event, the confessions. But they're very good examples, and what you're suggesting is that there are lessons that we could learn from the way confession works and what it suggests in terms of the lives of these people, which I really like. In Study in Scarlet, which is what you're talking about here, nothing will stimulate a confession more than suddenly finding yourself handcuffed in the presence of Scotland Yard and people wrestling you as you try to break through a window and get out of the room. That's a pretty good stimulus for a confession.
Yeah, I agree. There were a couple of others who were caught dead to rights too. Take Abe Slaney in The Dancing Men. Boy, here's a guy who certainly did not expect to be apprehended. He walked in, seemingly responding to a secret cryptic note from his lost love.
Yes.
But he said, "Boy, gentlemen, you really got the drop on me." I think it was partly out of despair, partly knowing that he had nowhere else to go, but despair out of the love that he had, whether it was a stalkerish, twisted love, for Elsie Cubitt. And out of concern that she was at death's door and he wanted to make sure that she wasn't accused of anything. There is, even in that moment of criminality, there's a bit of gallantry still there.
That is a great point. And I don't know that we've ever talked about that in Trifles. And the point is, the good side of villains. One of the nice things about Conan Doyle, and we've talked lately, not only on this show, but also on iHose, where we've recently talked about Conan Doyle's life and what he was all about. It distinguishes the cases of Sherlock Holmes and other literature because you do have these extra dimensions in the characters. And so, for example, in Sign of Four, even as an example, Jonathan Small. Now, Jonathan Small, you get to the end of the chase on the Thames, and this fellow who's been walking around London with one leg and a Andaman Islander, and apparently nobody's noticed him, is suddenly captured, and he's captured after a chase on a police boat, where shots have been fired, and his poor friend Tonga is dead. And that's how he comes to confess. But still in all, when we hear the story of Jonathan Small, he's very much someone who life has treated poorly. We find early on that he had an affair with a young woman that didn't go well. He left the country. He lost his leg to an alligator in a river. He was very poorly treated by people he trusted. He was betrayed. And that sets him up. And so there's still that he's not painted completely black. He's not a completely black and evil person like one or two other characters in the canon who have no redeeming characteristic, like Moriarty or like Black Peter. But, you do have this other dimension, and the same, in Study in Scarlet.
Yeah. And I think Conan Doyle does that, just out of, the nature of being a good storyteller, but also to build some level of complexity and realism into the story, because, as much as we like to think about good and evil, very little in this world is pure good or pure evil. We are all a mixture of something, and putting that level of sympathy into a character like Jonathan Small, who, as you note, was given a bad rap his whole life, always an uphill struggle. That builds the realism into it, and knowing that we're struggling with what's right and what's wrong. I mean, even the Sholtos, knowing that Mary Morstan's father's death happened in the presence of Major Sholto, he wanted to make sure that she got her share of the treasure. He didn't have to do that, and we see the greedy sons, kind of, or at least Bartholomew wanting to hoard it for himself. And we see what that gets him in the end, right? Mm. So there's this constant struggle. So.
That's true. And so the confession, tends to show in some cases tends to show the heart of the person's character, a suggestion of the person's character before the events that drove them to where they are. Unlike the really black characters. So now that I thought about Black Peter and Moriarty, there's also Charles Augustus Milverton, who is completely painted black. But very rarely, in the Milverton case and in maybe one other, very rarely does Holmes ever get to the point at the end of a case where he doesn't say this, but you sort of get the impression that he could have said, you know, Watson, I think I need to wash. This has just been very depressing. I just feel sullied by the events and these people, and very rarely happens to Sherlock Holmes.
That is true. That is true. Well, we're going to take a quick wash with our sponsor here, and we'll be right back talking more about confessions after this quick word. The latest issue of the Baker Street Journal is here, and it's filled with lots of great scholarship, as usual. For example, Bruce Detman takes a look at the exploits of Sherlock Holmes. That's right, it was a book full of pastiches in an era when pastiches were rare, brought to us by Adrian Conan Doyle and John Dixon Carr. Jim Webb takes a look at the intuition of Sherlock Holmes and where that came from. M.A.K. Duggan looks at the surplice. That is the garment worn by Reverend Williamson in The Solitary Cyclist. Where did he get it? And where did he get his ministerial license? These and other fantastic accompanying pieces of Sherlockian scholarship wait for you in the latest issue of the Baker Street Journal. Make sure you subscribe today by going to BakerStreetIrregulars.com. You know, you mentioned, Bert, Holmes never mentioning he had to wash. I think the exception, of course, as you said, was Milverton, where he said, do you feel that shrinking, creeping sensation? This is a guy that gives you the willies, basically. but even Milverton, as we're talking about confessions, could not keep it from Holmes that he took great pride in his work. He showed off. He mentioned a few other cases that he had maturing. And almost as if to brag about his situation. He couldn't help himself. That's how smarmy Milverton was.
Yes, the sin of pride and boasting. Yeah. Nicely constructed characters.
In a similar vein, and I apologize that I can't speak with great authority on this one because it's one of my least favorite stories, or at least it's a story that I haven't spent a lot of time with, and that is the Mazarin Stone. Again, it's the pride of the criminal, who in this case, Count Silvius thinks he is alone with Sam Merton, and basically exposes the whole game, exactly what he's up to. And how clever he is to be able to outsmart Sherlock Holmes. So again, it's a point of pride in the criminal's, quiver, as it were. And again, because of Holmes's, machinations, because he was able to set himself up, not as the wax dummy, but actually physically sitting, there in the corner of the bow window, he was able to overhear, the confession. Same thing in The Dying Detective. When you get Culverton Smith entering Holmes's bedroom and Watson crouching behind the bookcase there, he is just too prideful to be able to keep it to himself. This strikes me in terms of villains and confessions as the classic James Bond problem. Where you've got the villain who has to have the monologue, the pontification, dangling in front of our hero. Which does nothing except stroke his ego and give our hero more time to figure a way out of the jam.
Yes. Well, lately, the last few years, there have been movies and other things that spoof that, where the villain will say, I suppose this is the point in time where you expect me to tell you exactly what's going on and give you the chance to escape, but I don't think I'll do that. And then he takes out a gun and he shoots whoever the other person is and theoretically startles the audience.
Right, right. Well, some other confessions I want to call out here. Again, I'm seeing a very common thread through all of these. Let's see, the solitary cyclist, the Abbey Grange, and let's say the cardboard box. When you think about the solitary cyclist, the Abbey Grange, and the cardboard box, what similarities do you see behind the confessions of people like Carruthers and Captain Crocker and Jim Browner from those?
Well, they come when they're all caught dead to rights, basically.
They do. And to me, each of them revolves around some sort of love, whether it was twisted, whether it was misdirected. You've got Carruthers who had to admit that they played cards for who would have the right to woo Violet Smith. And you can tell that after meeting Violet Smith and spending time in her company, that he genuinely regretted that. And I think in the Granada series, we see this play out really well. Yes. Captain Crocker, well, again, here's a case where he fell in love with a married woman, knew her from her trip over, couldn't do anything about it, but wanted to stand up to her abuser, right? And out of a case of love, murdered him on her behalf. And Jim Browner, here's a case of double murder. Because his wife was cheating on him and his sister-in-law turned him against her in a certain way, and how regretful he was at the end and horrified he was with himself, that love caused him to do something as horrific as he did. And he made a full confession of it.
Mm. Well, confession is good for the soul. And, Conan Doyle, probably unconsciously thought, in his consideration set in creating characters and in his view of life, I think was thinking about redemption and was thinking about everlasting life and being damned. Now, that's not particularly clear when looking at Conan Doyle, but I guess my point is that these people have these extra dimensions that we've talked about that make them very authentic, and it's a good. It certainly is a feature of these three cases that you call out: cardboard box, Abbey Grange, solitary cyclist. People who are led astray by their own passions.
And there's so many other cases we could go through because many times this is exactly how we determine that Holmes was right, as he gets the criminal or the accused to confess. I think about, people like, not Horner, in the Blue Carbuncle, Ryder.
Yeah,
James
I was
Ryder.
thinking about Blue Carbuncle. Yeah, Blue Carbuncle is unsatisfactory in that area, I think, only because he is such a crumb bun.
A shrimp. Yeah. Well, I think this goes into the other realm of confessions, which is someone confessing to save his own skin. There are a few of those. And we could say that, redemption, is the ultimate saving of one's own skin, not necessarily from the law, but from a higher judgment. People on death's door who are making a clean breast of things like, Anna in the Golden Pince-Nez, or Turner in the Boscombe Valley Mystery, knowing that they're going to be dying soon. And even Jefferson Hope back in Study in Scarlet. They just want to cleanse their soul. And Ryder, I think, is as you say, he's a crumb bum. He really he realizes what a horrible mistake he's made, and he doesn't have anything to show for it. So
yeah. What about Stockbroker's Clark, though? I don't remember the details enough. Is there, I remember, those two and Stockbroker's Clerk being pretty redemption free. I mean, being just pretty disagreeable, but I don't remember enough about.
He was. Well, there was, he was rescued from attempted suicide at that point. And I don't know, he wasn't trying to save himself or anything. He was just, I think at a moment of weakness, Holmes managed to extract it from him. It's the only thing I can come up with.
And a good case, of someone who I guess has this redemptive feature is Leon Sterndale in Devil's Foot, because he's generally freed to go do his good work in another country far away.
Well, we assume it's good work. We don't know for certain, do we?
No.
Well, that and many other things are just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Now, give me a true account of everything that happened at the Abbey Grange last night. Be frank with me, and we may do some good. Play tricks with me, and I'll crush you.